Welcome to the first program in a series. Our focus today, helping us all understand the implications of climate change for ourselves and our children. Many of us here are members of Elders Climate Action, an organization working to mobilize elders and community members of all ages to address climate change, while there is still time to protect and address the impact on future generations. My name is Rick Lent. I'm a member of the leadership team of Elders Climate Action. I am joined by Paul Cohen, Chelmsford Town Manager, Margo Woods, Watertown resident, background in public health. Interestingly, she just recently completed a study of 3 towns who've completed some of the work that Chelmsford's engaged in. Bern Kosicki, retired with a background in physics, and Tom Amiro, retired Chelmsford resident with a background in physics. I come from
psychology.
Psychology. Okay. That's right. Bern's physics, right? Sorry. Yes. Today we focus on community preparedness for climate change. We use Chelmsford as our focus, but the ideas here apply to and come from almost any community in this area. So that's why in particular, we want Paul here. Paul, you recently completed a climate preparedness study known as the Municipal Vulnerability Preparedness Study of the town with help from a state grant. Mm-hmm. What led you to do this study?
I think it's the whole issue of climate change is foremost on the minds of our residents, our town officials, and certainly on the state government who sponsored the statewide program, which Margo, I know, will get into other communities later on. And so we saw the opportunity to conduct a program study of the issues and challenges in Chelmsford. We were a recipient of a state grant for $50,000. We brought on board a consulting firm, and we engaged the citizenry and stakeholders in order to do an in-town assessment.
Were there any surprises?
I don't know if there are any surprises. I think the surprises were probably the scope of the issues, is that we tend to think of climate change as, well, primarily an ecological or environmental issue. But then in our discussions, we saw that it was beyond that. It was also a human issue in terms of how do you communicate to vulnerable populations, during times of emergency or in getting the message out and so forth. So it goes beyond just the physical. It also goes to the human element. And I think that sort of surprised people because we tend to think about global warming and temperature change and storms and severe weather events and so forth. But most of what I think came out of ours was the human element of what does this mean for our residents of today and those who will come after us.
You may want to bring those up as we go forward, some of the specific examples. In fact, this is a sort of a link. I mean, how would any of you see climate change affecting you or your families personally?
Well, I expect in the future that there'll be more power outages and more oppressive hot days. Probably get water in my basement. Haven't had it in a number of years, but if we get as much precipitation as they're projecting, and I'll probably have to go further north to find good snow for cross-country skiing.
That already happened to me last winter. I had to go north of Concord, New Hampshire to find snow for cross-country skiing.
Okay, yeah. I think from my point of view, it's the idea that in the beginning we're talking about what can towns do, and we can get some money in and do something that Massachusetts set up to do. But I think that in the long run, it's going to ask more of us. What kind of changes are we willing to make? And I think that is a communication issue. Yep. How can we communicate with our citizens? How can they unite together? And how can we get to know our neighbors so we can really support everyone in the community?
There's some of the hazards that we think about. The near-term hazards are flooding, wind, and temperature issues. We just moved into our house. It was built in '57 a couple of years ago from a different town. And the first thing I had done was a mass save audit to check on the insulation. We found there was no insulation in the walls, and so we had that done. Our particular lot has marshland or wetlands in the back of it And so we're concerned about possible future flooding. And a second thing is we had large pine trees near our house. And pine trees are typically not very strong in winds. And we had one actually fall down a year ago last winter after an ice storm. So we had some taken down. So these kinds of issues have been on our mind.
Yeah, yeah. Margo, some towns completed their municipal vulnerability preparedness report. We call that MVP. I'm not going to say that phrase again. They completed it a few years back. I know we did in my town, Stowe. What steps did you find the towns you surveyed have taken to respond once that report was finished?
Well, what I know is about 3 towns. We looked at Gloucester, we looked at Arlington, and we looked at Sudbury. And when we went in and we interviewed the different people that were involved in the project, and we asked them, well, what was your greatest successes and what were their greatest, kind of problems or hindrances? And it was really interesting to hear. Again, when you go in for this grant, you can get up to $250,000 for a year or 2, but you commit yourself to then showing that the town public buildings can decrease their energy use by 20%. So then you have to look at, okay, what can we do with this kind of money? Where do we get our biggest, payment for the buck? And what we found is that they found that they needed a lot more communication between the different departments, because the departments were like silos, and now you needed them to cooperate a lot more, and there weren't many times they had to do that. We found that they also kind of felt that they had a hard time with sometimes contractors, and they asked actually the program if they could please vet some of the contractors so they could deliver what they said they were going to deliver. But I think also it is the idea that they also felt that they had a hard time having their citizens know they were a green community. So there's like some PR that had to be done. We're a green community, we should be working on that. So those are some of the high points.
That's interesting, because I just found out Chelmsford is a green community, and I live in Chelmsford over 20 years.
Yes, people don't know.
Well, you become a green community once you do the MVP study. Is that right?
Although the original iteration of the Green Communities Program under Governor Patrick goes back now a decade, and Chelmsford was in the first round of the Green Communities designation. So we probably haven't done a good job lately of promoting it, but we were in that first group of communities. I think they were probably...
Actually, just to the recent year, you've gotten the maximum. I was at the Energy Conservation Committee, and I think it was $200,000 a year, which is really nice.
Very nice.
Got $85,000 this year. Let's hope next year we get back. But yeah, we've been.
So you're into your 3rd or 4th grant?
Edition?
Oh yeah, at least
great.
excellent.
Okay.
At least
Very
that,
good.
But that's different than the MVP.
That's different than the MVP.
Yes.
All right, there's a Green Communities Competitive Grant Program, and then there's the MVP program, which is the MVP is an iteration of the Baker administration, which is dealing with the whole issue of climate change, and obviously a lot of the emphasis, particularly, is on the coastal communities, but it goes across statewide in terms of the issues of, as noted earlier, about severe rain events, severe wind events, and just the challenges of over time in terms of how your infrastructure is able to confront those challenges.
Yeah, I know in my town, some of the issue is around the older buildings. We don't have a new library. You have a new library. We don't. We have a historic library with historic energy challenges and an older town building and so forth. And so they've been trying to meet the 20% threshold. Our town energy manager is running around measuring every building he can, and then putting in heat pumps and other technology to bring it down, and insulation.
It goes back to the Energy Star certification and others, and that's probably what they're doing in Stowe. And we've done that. We've got a number of buildings certified in Chelmsford.
Great.
So, Paul, the report was supposed to be submitted this June. So, I mean, that happened.
It has been submitted, yeah.
Okay.
That's been submitted. We're awaiting certification of the program. We also, in relation to that, the state requires you to do a hazard mitigation assessment to update your hazard mitigation plan. And again, that goes to the whole issue of vulnerabilities and how you respond in emergency situations. So, and then their next new round of grant funding for those certified communities is out. And so we're hoping to be funded in that program.
You just used a term that comes up a lot, and I know I get it confused. ask some people that work with me, between these two terms, mitigation and adaptation. And it comes out in legislation and other things. And you might, do you want to describe how those apply to the town, those two terms? Or maybe not. Maybe we're going to look at Bern. I don't know.
I'll go to the physicist.
I'm one of the ones that struggle with that definition, but from what I've heard among the advocates, mitigation is when you directly try to stop the thing from happening. For example, climate change. And adaptation is when we try to treat the effects of climate change. At least that's the terminology I'm using right now.
And to my understanding right now, there has been fairly good state support for measures for adaptation, especially things like against relative to like coastal flooding and so forth, near an imminent danger in a way for some.
There is a state bill that just passed through the House, the so-called Greenworks bill, I guess, from Speaker DeLeo and Representative Golden, and we'll see what happens there. That's supposed to be directed at both issues, but probably will end up more being an adaptation kind of resiliency bill.
So let me use this as a sort of a transition to, we've got a couple of slides that talk about the nature of the challenge that we face when it comes to adaptation and mitigation. Can we have that slide on how will global temperatures change? So global temperatures are already rising. You may have heard this past July in Massachusetts was the hottest ever on record since records have been taken. Scientists use different models to project the impact of human activity on the future climate. In other words, how much are we going to have to prepare for? Or are there ways we can mitigate for one of those alternative futures? So, do you want to explain what the assumptions are behind the several lines on that graph?
Yeah, I'll take a shot at that. So the red line, first of all, everything below to the left of 2015 has already happened, and we're projecting a couple of different scenarios after that. The red line is with higher emissions, and at the time this chart was written, that's the line that the world was following. We're probably doing a little better than that right now. And below that are some lower emission possibilities. If you look to the y-axis, 2 degrees C is red, and that was a target that a large number of climate scientists wanted the world to be lower than by the time we hit 2100, which is on the right-hand side of the chart. So none of these lines on the chart actually do that, but that's been our goal up until recently, in which more recently the scientists have lowered that goal from 2 degrees to 1.5 degrees.
And in Massachusetts, as of 2008, we had a goal of lowering Massachusetts statewide emissions to 80% of 90 degrees, of 1990 levels,
Right.
80% of 1990 levels. And so that would have been following some of those projections, but that doesn't represent anything like that new lower blue line we need.
That's right. Yeah. So we need to really step up a little bit and try to get on what the climate scientists are now recommending.
Yeah.
Could I
Yeah,
just,
sure.
for most people, centigrade, Fahrenheit, we think Fahrenheit, and so 1.5 degrees centigrade is 2.7 degrees Fahrenheit increase, and 5 degrees centigrade is an increase of 9 degrees Fahrenheit, which is
That's a lot.
the projected worst case. That everyone would feel that.
Well, so we have a slide. The next slide, I think, gives us a sense of, we can imagine if you have people, friends or relatives that live in more southern states, the way I understand this slide, and Bern, you can correct me, is as things get worse, it's like Massachusetts climate was no longer in Massachusetts. It was in, Pennsylvania, New Jersey. Oops, now it's Virginia. Oh, geez, it's down in the Carolinas.
Southern Carolina.
Southern Carolina.
This should be an animated slideshow. Moving.
Right.
But you got to wonder or ask, what's it going to be like for Southern Carolina?
Yes. Yeah. So, and then we have another slide on levels of rainfall, because as the temperature change, the overall climate impact, one of the first impact, and this comes back to concern for flooding, which is relative to Chelmsford and to any homeowner. So we're looking at projections for very heavy rainfall of 71%.
That's a big increase.
That's a huge increase. But that, Bern, correct me, is that under the worst case assumption, that top line that we were looking at a few months?
Well, that's increase that's already been observed from.
Oh, that's right. It does say observed increase, right?
So we're looking to project that into the future. I think for much more, and the number isn't on this slide, but just looking at those numbers is not so compelling. But if you look at the next slide, I think
Next slide?
it shows some of the things that can happen. We're familiar with all of the flooding that the Midwest has had, and in Houston. And maybe it's below the radar, but we've had some bad floods around the Northeast also, in Vermont and Connecticut. And this shows some of the ravages of those floods.
And didn't Chelmsford had some damage, or North Chelmsford had some damage a few years ago?
If you go back a decade, we had a series in a period of 4 years. We had 2 flood events in the Merrimack River at Williamsburg,
Right.
where the river rose, due to the melting and rainfall and so forth. Where, we residents couldn't stay in some of the units there, and it was an emergency response during those periods. That's our most vulnerable area.
And I was interested when I was reading the report, the idea that you have, 7 dams?
Yes.
That, obviously are going to have to be looked at, and the idea that you're on the Merrimack River, itself. So.
Yeah, fortunately, they're not critical life safety dams in terms of their assessment. One thing that Chelmsford's fortunate about is we don't have many bridges or vulnerable areas in terms of water dams and so forth in town. The river is the boundary in terms of you go between Tingsboro and Chelmsford, or you're heading towards Lowell. So we're fortunate in that respect, and so that's why, again, when we had the severe storms and issues, they were really limited to the river basin.
So this is all about, now I'm going to go back to those 2 words. This is all about adaptation so far. We're talking about adaptation. And I'd say that's probably the main focus of the MVP report. What about the other side? Steps and measures that the town is considering to help people, maybe it's to help homeowners, maybe it's to help the town as a whole, lower, get more on that lower curve by lowering our emissions of greenhouse gases.
Let me start with some of the things we've already instituted. Right now, 100% of the town's electricity consumption is funded from solar. And that goes back a decade. We purchased a capacity at a solar farm in Bolton, Mass. Since then, we've not only have that capacity, but we've also installed solar panels on all of our school buildings, our DPW building, and soon to be our senior center. Also, we have electric vehicle charging stations in 3 locations in town, at the Adams Library, the town offices, and in Vinyl Square. The town has electric vehicles and hybrid vehicles. We do an electricity aggregation program that I think that now has a mixture of clean energy, and I would expect the next iteration will probably be 100% clean energy. And so and never mind the energy efficiency programs. I mean, we embarked on a $19.1 million energy performance contract that included not only the solar, but provided for more energy efficient HVAC programs. Because again, if you've got dated buildings, as we were noting earlier, they weren't constructed with today's energy efficiency standards in mind. We also did obvious things, as noted earlier, about it, building insulation, weather sealing, all those aspects. And we even promoted the community solar program. So we're continuing to, and that's why we undertook this study, say what more can we do? Because as you said, there's more to be done.
That's great. I didn't know that you've made all that progress. It's
Yes, that
super.
sounds great. I'm interested in trees, so I just wanted to, I think it's something you report
Yeah.
about having a robust tree program, obviously
Yep.
planting trees, and with the more storms, you're going to lose trees in the winter, and so therefore you need not just to replace them, you got to grow more. You know.
Yeah, we have a one-for-one tree program. So if a tree is removed by the town, another tree is planted. We're also looking at expanding our tree canopy, which I think is what you're speaking of. And in fact, we expect to be coming forward in the spring to do a new tree canopy program around the town common, as well as the access road that goes to the common. Because not only is it climate friendly in terms of the preservation of soils and climate cooling, it's also very beautiful.
It's beautiful.
And
Everyone would
particularly
love
if you
it.
plant what I call the native trees of New England, and that's not pine trees, as we know. What people forget often about New England is New England was almost clear cut for from forestry to its farmland, and so now if you go back and do forestry programs and tree programs, well, I think the emphasis should be on the natural and native trees of New England, as opposed to some of the more common trees such as pines that really weren't native to this area. I mean, it's really a hardwood area, your oaks and so forth. That's really where you want to go to. Your chestnuts and again, some of those were blighted by disease, like the emerald ash borer and so forth today, but there are now disease-resistant ones that I think should be looked at. And so we're looking to do that in the town.
Could I ask, do we have a tree warden?
Yes, we have a tree committee as well as a tree warden.
Okay.
And so the tree committee meets generally monthly or every 2 months and sort of oversees that program.
Super.
There was mention of a hardy tree program in the MVP report.
Yes.
Exactly.
And so maybe, but I've looked everywhere and talked to people, and nobody actually knew anything about it.
Yeah, the tree committee's worked
just-
on a tree inventory, believe it or not, and that's taken a lot of time.
Yeah.
A lot of effort, but that's been their first focus.
But anyway, it might be good to
We're a tree
publicize.
city. Chelmsford's a tree city. We obtained the tree city designation, I think, about 4 or 5 years ago.
Oh, good.
And I think the other thing that's helpful, people say you want the trees, not only because it's beautiful, increases your real estate property and all like that, but it is 10 degrees, at least 10 degrees cooler under the trees.
Yeah,
You know?
even just
you
from here
notice
to
it.
the other side of the table, if you've got a tree in the
So
shade.
one of your grant requests for the MVP would be money to grow, plant more trees for the shade, for the killer heat, to prepare for killer heat.
That'd be great.
Exactly.
There's another state program, which I'll just give a plug, because we're in it in Stowe right now, which is to help homeowners put in heat pumps, air source heat pumps. You've got green electricity. We need more air-conditioned homes in the summer, and we need heating that doesn't use fossil fuels in the winter. Has Chelmsford looked into that Mass CEC heat pump program? It's called Heat Smart.
Yeah, we haven't. We've done the Solarized Mass program,
Yeah.
but we haven't branched into the Heat Smart. So that's probably the next step.
Yeah, they're experimenting. What you realize, as our town is in it, that's a huge challenge, because by 2050, if Massachusetts is going to meet its goals, all of us, all our homes will have to be off fossil fuels, and we'll all have to have air conditioning. And then you look at, well, okay, there's the technology, but everybody's house is different. How do you make it work? And it's a big engineering challenge, and it will employ.
And how expensive is it?
It varies, depends on the house, a lot.
Okay, a lot.
Yeah, and there are incentive programs, there's free loan programs, interest-free loan programs and things like that too. But it's a challenge.
Again.
Is there anything else you think individual homeowners should be doing to prepare for climate change? Really anyone, or Paul, or any of you? I mean, we're going to get into this more in later programs, I'm sure, but it just, if we were to say, have you thought about, I guess insulation would be one.
Yeah, to that I'd add, bring up climate change in conversations with others. I think that it tends to get pushed to the background and not talked about very much because it's not immediate, but it's something that has to be taken care of. And so that'd be my advice.
I also would like to hear people talk to each other, like get to know your neighbors, because there might be a time we really need each neighbor and have to kind of coordinate, and very often we're not ready to do that. I also wanted to make a plug for the idea that, we feel like there's things that the town can do, but there are going to be other times when we're going to have to do more, because we know that Canada and the United States have the highest carbon footprint in the world. And if you look at Germany and Italy and France, they have 1/3 of it. And they're not suffering. Their quality of life is really good. And so I really couldn't say we're going to have to do more. They've been working on it for 30 years. We can learn from them, and we can we have to do catch up really fast.
So the big thing is for each of us to believe in the R, reduce. I mean,
Yes.
reduce the amount of electricity
Yes.
you're using. And there's little things you can do. I mean, like you can get a soda stream carbonating system so you don't have to buy cans of carbonated water.
That's right.
Reduce.
You pay a fortune for.
Right. You know, things like replacement windows, gutter barrels, so that you take that water and you use it for your garden. Here's one no one would probably think of: digital antenna. So that when we have the power outages and Comcast or whatever goes down, you'll be able to get
News.
Chelmsford TV. Oh, and the news.
Right. What's
and
happening.
weather,
Yes,
AccuWeather.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, I want to thank you all. This is just the start of a series, and we'll take future programs going forward. We'll tape programs on what you can do in your own home, as well as around the community. Maybe we'll get to a point where we're talking about a net zero school in Chelmsford. Yeah. So we hope to do that. Elders Climate Action meets regularly in Chelmsford and in the greater Boston area. We usually have a meeting once or twice a month, one place or another. It's very educational. We put it's all free. We put a big push behind educating ourselves so that we can educate our families and the people we talk to. Please join us. You can find meeting announcements through our website and through our Facebook page. And we look forward to seeing some of you at our meetings and coming back here and doing the next in this series. Thank you very much, Paul.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Margo. I appreciate it. And Bern and Tom. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you for watching.